These are yours, Patrick? These yours? Yeah, okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming in. And this is... Thanks, everybody, for coming in. I think we're ready to start. If you could do me a favor and turn your phone off, please. Thank you. Phone's off. Thank you. Welcome to this afternoon's symposium. Terrific to see you all in here in the lecture hall for Parametricism 2.0, Rethinking Architecture's Agenda for the 21st Century. It's an event that coincides with the launch of this publication by the very same name, guest edited by Patrick Schumacher. It's a pleasure to welcome Patrick and everybody involved today back here to the school for what I know is going to be a fantastic event and update on an architectural project that began in this room and other rooms around here many, many years ago. And in many different forms, and has evolved in striking and interesting ways that today's contributors are going to be presenting to us. So just briefly, thank yous. First, Patrick, for bringing the event here. All of the contributors who've come in this afternoon for the presentations that we're going to see in the next couple of hours. And especially Helen Castle, who at AD has been incredibly supportive for many projects like this and gave us the opportunity to launch this publication here at the Architectural Association. I'm not going to say too much about parametricism for many reasons, mostly though because of the contributions that are going to be made over the next couple of hours talking about the state of play, let's say, in that particular project. 2 or 3 thoughts on it. First, I think one of the things that the idea of a parametric architecture today puts in play or allows us to rethink is the relationship between architecture and the city, most certainly, and probably in an even more focused way, the relationship between architectural form and that thing we call the architectural program. And I think both of those interests, you could say, are one reason why the ideas around this work have attracted the audience, the critics, the proponents, the antagonists, and the interested followers that it has. I think those are 2 incredibly disciplinary projects in a world of architecture today, and I think unlike many other contemporary projects in architecture, those 2 interests, architecture and its relation to the city, and the question of form and its relation to programs, sit absolutely central to not just the larger question of parametricism and computational approaches to design in architecture and other fields today, but also in iteration 2.0, which stands on the cover of the publication that Patrick and the contributors will be talking about in today's event. There is, of course, the stylistic claim of parametricism that I think many in this room know all too well and have known for many years before, when in about 2008 or 9, Patrick, in an essay of a previous issue of AD, made that claim that this wasn't simply an approach or a sensibility in architectural design and thinking. It was the basis potentially for rethinking the idea of what style might be in architecture. I think that might very much be the case, that style is certainly on the table today and in ways many of us are surprised by. Having lived through an era of late modernism where style was always thought of as a kind of historical project more than anything else. But what I'd like to draw attention back to today, and I think what version 2.0 in parametricism and this issue is really looking at, is again the claim of whether or how architecture and its form and structure and spaces can express the lives that are lived within architectural space. The social function that Patrick points to in his essay within this book. I think parametric sensibilities in architecture today, at least if you read things online and in magazines, is almost always talked about in terms of other architectural antecedents. And in fact, this issue contains essays by Mark Burry. It contains an essay by Mark Burry that touches on figures like Gaudí, Frei Otto, and the kind of contemporary heroes that many people in this building particularly know and know extremely well. To stand back slightly from that view, which I know won't be really on the foreground of today's discussion, but I think one of the interesting features of that idea of approaching space and its making through what are at times empirical, statistical, computational, algorithmic approaches to how we arrange things is that that project within architecture does resonate within a larger contemporary space in interesting and unexpected ways. And if you look at something like data journalism today, for example, what Nate Silver calls data journalism and the idea of data-driven accounts of the world around us, for those of you that know Siegel and the Noise, his book, the founder of the great 538 blog in the States, an interest in statistical or numeric approaches to what's happening in the world around us sits far outside of architecture and its form-making today. We live in a world saturated by the production of information and data and numbers, and our ability to navigate and move through that world is one of the interesting larger cultural contexts, I would say, by which you could understand what's happened over the last decade, especially with the kind of project that Patrick and his collaborators have been working on, not just here at the ABE and in their practices worldwide, but in relation to many other design disciplines. The discipline of bibliometrics in modern science, which is well established over the last 30 or 40 years, in which the accounting of everything from authorship to the way ideas travel between different projects, gives us another frame of reference by which to think of computational or algorithmic work within architecture today. And indeed, even in the more extreme version of someone like Franco Moretti's work on digital humanities and the idea of rewriting literary histories or theories through a compilation of information by which those texts are being seen in completely different ways, I think just provides another reminder that this sensibility that's being experimented with and worked on within schools like this or offices like Patrick's or fields like architecture today does have a larger cultural context, something hard for us sometimes to think about as architects who will almost always and inevitably be thinking about other architects when they look at their work. I think this current issue that's just arrived today that you all get a chance to see is a fantastic kind of contemporary summation of where that project stands today. And without further ado, let me just hand it over to Patrick and we'll get the day started. Thank you everybody for coming in. Tempted to take your notes and like on your own.
I don't need my notes, sorry. So welcome everybody. It's nice to have you all, and thanks for giving us this platform, Brett, and for your remarks. I will come speak twice today because we have a few people dropping off the list because of sickness and other reasons, and I'm also a little bit sick, but I'll give you more of my time. And so first of all, this is not just one particular project. I think it's the project, the only project which has true innovative force, which recognizes some of the new potentials of civilization with respect to computational intelligence. That's what we have absorbed into our repertoires and methodologies. And there, of course, there has been a number of there has been a slowdown in the convergence of the whole field towards this new paradigm. And that's one of the themes of this particular magazine and the relaunch of Parametrism 2.0, to reflect in the introductory essay why that convergence and flourish has kind of, to some extent, slowed down and be defrayed and not pulled through. Because as of yet, although Zaha Architects has put down quite a few major projects, and in the first article we're showing a lot of other major projects which are 100% within the stylistic repertoire of parametricism, and these are airports, for instance, and commercial firms are involved, as SOM Mumbai Airport or Fuxas Shenzhen Airport or our new Beijing Airport. Just to give an example, major railway stations, our Galaxy projects, multi-use, major complexes are put down, but it's still a drop in the ocean. And the discipline hasn't kind of pulled through, as it were, and that's why I think the relaunch is important. The discipline remains confused between a lot of retro styles that is pulled back to, and I think anyway needs a major upgrading. And in my introductory talk, I'm pointing out a number of urgent, let's say, steps I'm willing to take to ramp up the rhetoric, intensify the rhetoric on a number of fronts. First, against the detractors who refuse to integrate intelligence with many other disciplines are integrating. That's one point, but also self-criticism with respect to the movement of parametricism, of not having sufficiently taken on board and understood the sociological depth and historical pertinence of the repertoires which are coming through the methodologies, and we are kind of stuck within the movement in a mindset of focusing on technological functionality and rationales. And I will talk to that, perhaps in the second talk in particular, picking out some of the speakers who are present here and trying to analyze their personas, careers, trajectories, rhetorics in a friendly fashion. It's not going to be psychoanalysis, but it will be architectural theoretical analysis within the terms of my architectural theory, the theory of architectural autopoiesis, which founds architecture within social theory, and that must be so because we must be not only promoting and recognizing the technological superiority of some of those techniques and ways of working where we now can optimize and integrate into architectural repertoires, for instance, structural optimization, intelligences, fabrication logic intelligences, environmental sophisticated tools feed into our repertoires, and so our products become far more, let's say, technologically sophisticated, and finally, in terms of engineering logics, pragmatically superior on the technological level. But we need to realize that this can only be secondary, and the question remains, what should be the urban structure, the morphologies, the spatial structures and patterns of interaction we give to institutions in the city, how we're coping with the urban convergence and the challenges those place on building up a new level of complexity and intricacy in our urban life processes. To analyze that and to also methodologically tool up with respect to this is being elaborated in the two articles I'm putting forward. One, the urbanism-focused article, which tries to reimagine a complex, variegated urban order within the context of a market-based societal process and urbanization process. And then another article which talks about how we can actually handle the much more complex and fluid and intricate social processes of inhabitation with multiple audiences and much more dynamic flows, gathering and regathering, how we can kind of cope with that and demonstrate that the open, fluid, navigable textures we're designing under the label of parametricism actually have that sociological superiority. And through a new form of agent-based crowd modeling, which I call frame-dependent or semiologically enhanced crowds, that's the research project I'm laying out in that third article. We can hope to get a handle on the ultimate criteria of success, which clients and society would look forward to with respect to encounter density, frequency, relevancy, dwell times, and the whole pattern and of communicative interaction. We could start to simulate, measure, and home into and improve and work on, rather than being left with a few intuitive guesses and the kind of craft-like, experience-like reliance on an unreflective reliance on our an experienced architect's learning curve. And I want to just say one more word to what this for me means. It means for me that at the moment, the field of architecture, despite all its attempts to connect up with sociological discourses, political discourses, technological flourishes and sensibilities, is rather primitive. There isn't a consistent set of theoretical axioms and a paradigm to build on for this discipline and field to become a really sophisticated discourse practice on par with political economy, sociology, and such fields and disciplines, the social sciences in particular, which we should be tying into, and we should realize and theorize the built environment as a crucial layer which needs to be enhanced together with other societal structures to bring this civilization forward. So that's a kind of pretty harsh statement on the state of the discipline. I think it needs to be refounded in order to match up with the challenges of the 21st century. And it's nearly like a kind of sociology before Marx, Durkheim and Weber. It was just a series of anecdotes, to some extent nearly a housewifish chatter, which needed to be put on a sound theoretical footing and then build up a cumulative research project. And to some extent, to put it blunt and frankly, if you look at the characters, the key figures who populate our field, both on the pragmatic and the practical side, as well as on what we consider architectural theory, I find it incredibly unsophisticated and needs an enormous degree of upgrading. It is, to some extent, to put it harshly, also still on that level of a housewifish chatter. And that's a challenge I put forward. I think this particular issue of AD collects the most potent protagonists. That's the frontier of our field and discipline. And I think you all should be fully aware of it, participate it, and not lose out on skilling up and understanding this. And but again, there's a theoretical foundation of this I'm trying to deliver and push us collectively to the next stage and step. And of course, this theoretical foundation exists. It's the 2-volume Outer Purposes of Architecture, which I've published in 2010 and 2012. But it has been sitting more or less kind of like a dead letter. It's been hard to absorb. Maybe the field is just too unsophisticated yet, or there's only a few players who can absorb this. And so that's just I'm throwing out there. And I think the time of polite over-modesty is over, and we need to push forward with this project. And my challenge also to my colleagues here is that, and I will come back to you with a little presentation in the second half, how we need to own up our discipline and understand the free-floating rationales which are as yet implicit within your works with respect to the contribution to architecture, how we can tease them out, and I will do that when I come back. Because at the moment I think there's enormous potency in the work which is collected in this magazine, but it is hiding under a kind of engineering set of rationales which are potent and relevant and important, but are not fully reflective of the discipline's task in terms of organizing, articulating, and signifying a new level of an information-rich built environment which structures social processes on a new level of sophistication, and how we can ascertain that. So that's the challenge I would put down, and I open the floor, or anybody it should be quite an interactive session, the kind of Q&A, because we have a bit more time because some of the speakers kind of are sick. So let's discuss. So questions. Ramon. Is there a question?
Shall I go first or will you go first? No. The question really is, looking at this picture of poured concrete and thinking what a kind of short-term material concrete is. All our motorways at the moment are, like when Hammersmith flyover nearly fell down, all of them are in danger of collapsing. So the beautiful kind of aesthetic of the curves, how does one marry that with a more environmental functionalism of material? I know about Magnus Larsson's building with the sand rather than against the sand in the Sahara. And obviously that's a different kind of concept of concrete. But I mean, how far have we got in those directions?
Well, I have to disappoint you, this is not concrete, although we have done a lot of concrete. This is in fact metallic surfaces. Yes, but I think my discourse wouldn't focus on technical issues as such. That's not what I would foreground. But I would rather ask the question: what would be the purpose of you introducing curvature in the first place? And in what context are we introducing curvature? And we're introducing curvature in a context of building up an unprecedented level of spatial complexity in an urban institutional environment, or in this case a mixed-use, multi-use complex which contains literally hundreds and hundreds of small startup companies, shops, businesses, restaurants. And there are other images I will show later about how this starts to look like. It is a very, very deeply layered three-dimensional space of simultaneity where you have offerings above, below, all around in layers, and you can move seamlessly from outside to inside. And with each step and move, vistas change, new things come into view and things fall out of view. But it's all structured through a formalism which you can get used to and navigate, and the curvature helps that to give a coherent, law-like, nature-like consistency to the environment so that you can orient, navigate, and you can follow convex versus concave, units of interaction, bodies and voids, trajectories, and that's far easier to follow a kind of continuous curve. And again, it has to have the degrees of freedom to not be just an arc, but be pushing and pulsing in ways that are prescribed by the context or the conditions of laying out a space. These are two hints why we're using curvature and why what we're trying to do can only be done with curvature.
I completely agree with that, but I am still very concerned that unless we address the material of the future in terms of the environment and climate, we're not really addressing the big issues of where we're going. I don't see them as being exclusive, but I do think that understanding the nature of the materials and the change, I mean, that's why Magnus Larsson comes to mind, because he doesn't think we have to fight the sand, he thinks we work with the sand. I mean, obviously he's not doing what you're doing, but there must be, in this embracing of complexity, there must be ways of expanding the uses of different kinds of materials.
Absolutely. I mean, for material research is all welcome, and we are invested and interested also in environmental lightness and light-footedness, even as a driver to push new morphologies. But there are at the same time couldn't be the end game. This is just a constraint. We need to first formulate how to live and communicate and enhance our productivity, and then we ask the question, how can we do that in the most light-footed way? And so we can't inverse these hierarchies, because the most energy-efficient life process might be a kind of prison for us, and wouldn't allow us to sustain the next level of productivity gains. So we got to be clear about the hierarchy of agendas and means. And to some extent, it is an accident that in the whole design process, the client, it might be the public, the state, the government, corporations, or anybody trying to host a piece of society into the city, would come to the architect first, because and then the engineering team follows suit, because engineers can only engineer something which has been designed and conceived, and there must be an intentionality. And the kind of prospective vision about what is to be done, and then we discuss how it is to be done. But of course, as we're going through this, a number of times we're already anticipating engineering issues, and in fact, I will talk about this later, a lot of the research in this magazine is premised on the fact that we're closely tying in with the most sophisticated engineering logics in order to pre-build these constraints in, but also, and that was something I will articulate later, because going away from what we already know and letting another force be shaping might be quite interesting in terms of bringing surprising expansions of repertoires. They have the congeniality of already having engineering logics, but in themselves, they also have that freshness and newness of an expanded repertoire we wouldn't have thought of hadn't we temporarily shackled ourselves to another logic. So I think that's the hidden, the unspoken rationale of a lot of this work, which talks about engineering purposes, but really is using that as an engine of invention to expand repertoires of space making and space articulation. Ramon.
So, do you think, like, in order to truly revolutionize architecture, like the role of the architect can be the same as it is now, or do you think that, like, also maybe that has to evolve to become more of an actor in like a political scale or in the way our society works together?
Well, the role of the architect has been evolving through a number of centuries. I think it was established through Alberti, when you had the discipline forming itself and crystallizing out against the construction kind of troop through the medium of the drawing, and then prior to construction of full speculation and drawing up and perspectively simulating of a design artifact, which could then be very innovative and required theorizing, because you wouldn't just routinely, tradition-bound building do what you've always been done. So that idea of the architect as a creator, ex nihilo nearly, and imagining a new future, drawing it and arguing about it, that's the architect. But at the time, I mean, this has been distilled. This was not only the architect at the time, but also in the same person, those who have filled those spaces with paintings, sculptures, who were engineering them. They were also the proto-scientists. And over the centuries, it has been more and more distilled out into its essential element, which was there from the very beginning, that moment of imagining a spatiality in the space for a new life, or with an innovative thrust, and therefore backed up a theoretical argument. And I think there's been a number of bifurcations whereby, for instance, the art, painting, sculpture, etc., has kind of bifurcated off and is left behind. And at a later stage, the sciences also have been became separate. You know, in Leonardo it was still all in one figure, and of course the engineering disciplines have been broken up and split off, and we are kind of left naked. And a lot of us have not got used to that, because what we're left with seemingly is only the ineffable notion of an atmospheric or of a spatiality, of an expressiveness, of character and identity. A lot of these kind of phrases which seem to be homing in on an aesthetic, what we are all about, but we haven't managed to operationalize that. We are lost in a kind of vague fluid of terms. And that's why we're so all too eager and happy to pull back onto kind of the terra firma of an engineering logic. And you see that in Foster, all he ever presents is the engineering logics of his buildings, and maybe some basic pragmatic layout logics. So and I find that, you know, highly problematic, because he wants to be quite rational, but he seemingly, our discipline isn't. Now, I'm telling you, it is. Deeply, and all what this seems to be so ephemeral can now be fully rationalized and operationalized and instrumentalized under the theory of, for instance, aesthetic values. There's a calculus of navigation orientation. There's a science of configuration, meaning composition. There's an intelligence with respect to perceptual tractability and the phenomenology of space, and how one can get traction over that and work on it systematically, and the whole domain of meaning. That's the last frontier, that things mean something, and that we're navigating the built environment as a text, as a semiologically encoded, sociologically charged message and set of communications. That becomes tractable, and that's my project. So that's the core discipline, because the other elements. And now we can feel we are kind of upgrading ourselves and bringing under the spell of a rational discourse where you can criticize each other with arguments and test and compare. All these aspects which are crucial, and we always felt this is the core of our discipline, that we actually now can talk about and argue about them. And they're no longer the ineffable thing where everybody's opinion is just a personal opinion. And that must stop, because that's holding us back. That's the housewife-ish chatter which we are still in. Yeah?
Patrick, very quickly. You touch base on the fact that parametricism somehow has not picked up at the speed you were expecting. Can you expand a bit on this? Why do you think that a lot of new generation are, instead of working on this kind of discourse, they are simplifying to a diagram-based architecture?
Well, I mean, in my analysis, it's the financial crisis, largely. That's the big push, which it's not only a financial crisis, but it is a politicized society across many levels. So you have the Occupy movement coming right at that point. Then you have the European debt crisis and the European masses, unemployment and demonstrations and politicization. You have Arab Spring and those kind of things radiating across the Middle East and elsewhere. You have uproar in China as well at that time. So there's an enormous amount of, let's say, distraction and politicization, which at the same time the crash also meant that some of this work we've been creating was associated, because it, of course, as the frontier of technology, has a price tag and isn't instantly distributable across the globe, but needs to come in the central arenas where this level of complexity is most urgently required, high performance and high value conditions. That has tainted this whole work. And then the excesses of Dubai has tainted it further. So that's why there has been a kind of, and even architects who've been involved in this work kind of suddenly step back, and anti-iconicity and anti-icon, these things are not meant as icons, but of course if you have very radical new sort of processes, methodologies with rigor and morphologies, these things will become other looking, and they will initially draw attention, and that's then is called iconic. And of course some epigons then go straight into this without knowing what they're doing. And so a lot of architects, of course all ages, but in particular young architects, have pulled away from this, and partly it's a failing of that movement itself, where it hadn't been sufficiently reflected the sociological and historical depth of that movement, what it means. I mean, DRL was founded on the premise that we have to go beyond that exuberant play with new tools and new forms, which comes to the digital set of tools, and show its sociological depths, for instance, through having swarm formations, not just playful, but we have bureau landschafts, high performance corporate business campuses calling for this new complexity, intricacy, fluidity, new forms of urbanism. But that has never caught on sufficiently. So in a sense, I can't blame the young architects who find that the movement is kind of not speaking towards these massive sociological and political ongoings, seems to be mute, and that we are kind of left behind as talking about technical issues, and we are kind of techno fetishists, and so that I think is another part. So there's an element of self-criticism here we have to address. At the same time, I think that although I understand that a lot of schools therefore moved into turned architecture schools into political debating clubs, which would then these debates would then be expressed in kind of conceptual art pieces, if you like. But this is of course problematic. I mean, everybody wants to participate in this politicization, but you also need to remember that you have a certain disciplinary responsibilities, and you also shouldn't rely on just schools of architecture debating. There's a certain amateurishness about this, which I find problematic. But I fully understand it, and I think that's part of this effort here, that we have to claim that ground of politics, socioeconomic structures, deep sociological processes and patterns of institution building, and that's what I'm doing. I'm delivering this, but it's been a little bit lonely in terms of the field to bring this together, to bring the new understanding of social and political and sociological issues together with a new to understand the built environment's role within this, and then have an highly sophisticated, upgraded set of tools and intelligences which bring this together. And that's the project. And I think the project, there's enormous amount of intelligence in all. You will see that in these presentations where they tie into with not only new technologies, but this whole systems thinking, self-organization thinking, auto-process thinking, which we've drawn into this discourse, but without realizing that these discourses also have formulated a new understanding of the economy and of sociology and politics. But we have that congeniality, and we have, IA and augmented intelligence, swarm intelligence. These are incredibly pertinent, powerful concepts, which we can run with on many levels, but they haven't been understood with its political depth. That, for instance, and that's why I think we have to sometimes go back to the origin, maybe 20 years ago, when parametricism, or what wasn't called parametricism at the time, had more philosophical grounding in the writing of Deleuze-Guattari, for instance, where you can see the coincidences of an autonomia movement, of a political free flow of struggles and communications on the one hand, tying in with cybernetics and new biology discourses of self-organization, which then lead to IA structures. And so these things need to be synthesized, and that has partly been lost because, of course, we moved from philosophy into investing in working with algorithms and getting stuck down with structure and all sorts of logics, and we lost that sense. And people coming new into this, let's say in 2005, didn't have that memory of this much more profound grounding of the movement in a more sophisticated, let's say, philosophical reflection of where the civilization is going. That's a problem, and this problem needs to be addressed, and that's why I'm upfront about it. Yeah.
So you seem to suggest that at the heart of your project must be a generally agreed aesthetic theory. Is that a fair statement? Or a well-defined science of aesthetics, something like that?
Yes.
So where is that science of aesthetics?
It's in volume 1.
Yeah, no. So I certainly scanned volume 1, but speaking as
that's your problem.
So it seems to me that what we know about neuroaesthetics, which is the closest area to what constitutes a genuine science or of aesthetics, is pretty thin stuff.
Yeah, I'm not into it.
Enough for a working architect to actually make anything out of. And so where exactly does this program come from, presuming that it's not
No, it's not from that. It's not that.
Presuming that it's not all contained in volume 1. Where does it come from?
Well, it's also in volume 2. That continues, and it flows through the whole discourse as a category which seems to be mystical, mysterious, and yet potent and powerful. And I've reflected often about it when we at Zadian Architects, and we had laid out the diagrams, and we knew what the functional processes were, and we had kind of structure in place, but we had only, in terms of overall design effort and the investment of passion and working through, this was just 5%. 95% was invested in that kind of honing in, that poise, that tension, that compositional clarification and intensification, that structuring of the visual spatial field as an aesthetic sensation and atmosphere and so on. So that's it, but we couldn't, it wasn't talked about. It was hard to talk about it. A vocabulary was missing, and the rationale was missing. But I knew it couldn't be pure fetishism. That's just the one hint. But I think all my other co-speakers have is Theo still here? I mean, I've lost 3 speakers now. Where's Rob? Okay, I think I'll hand over. All right, thanks for the attention. To be continued. I'll come back later.
All right, thanks everybody for your attention, and thank you, Patrick, for the invitation and the platform. My name is Theos Sparopoulos, and I've been teaching with Patrick now for the last 15 years, and I originally moved to London in 1999, and with the events, with Zaha's passing and everything, it's been a kind of strange reminiscing and at the same time reflecting, actually, even on my own sort of path here, because in some way, I think this place in particular has lost really one of its real champions. So I just want to really recognize that. Zaha, in every capacity, was always first and foremost speaking about this place. And I think that that is very rare today, and especially within this culture of so-called star architects and all of this other kind of jazz that people talk about. It's unprecedented, I think, for someone to always first and foremost speak about this place as a space for where architecture can be sort of interrogated, explored, and for that I was always very thankful to her about this. I know that there are a lot of students, ex-students, faculty. There's a lot of people in the school that have had their time within the office, ranging from people like Shinek Ashira to Brett to myself to others. And I think one thing that's very important to me particularly is to try to think about how architecture can really start to create kind of new kind of frameworks for understanding. I'm not a person that tries to privilege what architecture should be, but I think I'm very much part of, I think, a growing sensibility that's trying to interrogate architecture as a form of spatial practice and to have that in a much larger and expanded field. My very minor contribution was joining the office in 2003. First time I had the opportunity to 3D print something. I think this was the only real 3D print that was done outside of a small object. And some of the challenges that came to me personally was, do I continue in this office, which was 35 people at the time, if I remember? Or do I start to try to problematize my own self and to try to see how I can sort of participate? And within the educational framework, with Patrick over 15 years now, we've had many kinds of conversations, and I think there's a shared sensibility which in a certain sense follows on in terms of my contribution, I guess, within this parametricism issue, and it really is at the heart to understand architecture as a form of communication, thinking of space as an interface, and in terms of responding to some of the criticism in the issue itself, like Mark Gage, to see this beyond just thinking about things as network, but to think at the heart of everything. The interaction between things is fundamental. So my contribution is quite small, and if it's okay with you, I'm going to read just the first part of it, which is more like a statement of purpose, I guess, for myself. In parallel to that, I will play a short video in the background that basically is highlighting one of the projects that I featured in the issue. So the article title is called Behavioral Complexity, Constructing Frameworks for Human-Machine Ecologies. And I started off with a quote by Rodney Brooks, who says, "It's going to be harder to distinguish what is alive and what is machine, and that boundary may start to become meaningless." This was in an interview in 1997. When revisiting the things with Zaha's passing, I had written an article for the Vienna studio, final publication, and one of the people that was coming to mind was actually Hans Hollein. So I start the article with his proclamation in 1968. Austrian radical architect Hans Hollein proclaimed, "Alles Architektur, everything is architecture." Published originally as a manifesto that appeared in the journal Bau, it was a provocation that reflected a heightened awareness of the limitations of traditional definitions of architecture in favor of an understanding of design as an experimental vehicle for construction of new forms of communication. Beyond building, Hollein stated, a true architecture of our time will have to redefine itself and expand its means. Many areas outside of traditional building will enter the realm of architecture. As architecture and architects will have to enter new fields. All are architects, everything is architecture. Architecture, an expanded field of experimentation, resonates with great magnitude today. As we live in an age where science fiction has become fact, our contemporary age is as radical as ever. with change, latency, and uncertainty being the new norm. The once comfortable and understood historical models of the past have proven limited in their capacity to engage and address the complexities of the contemporary condition. As we live in ever-evolving information-rich environments, the question is not why, but how can architecture actively participate? Towards a behavioral model for architecture. Conceiving architecture as an ecology of interacting systems moves the fixed and finite tendencies of the past towards spatial environments that are adaptive, emotive, and behavioral. Environments within this framework are attempts to construct interaction scenarios that enable agency, curiosity, and play, forging intimate exchanges that are participatory, emotive, and evolving over time. Interaction, understood as the evolving relationship between things, allows a generative and time-based framework to explore space as a model of interfacing that shifts the tendencies of passive occupancy towards an active and evolving ecology of interacting agents. The work argued for here moves away from the known models that reinforce habitual responses within architecture towards an understanding of an adaptive ecologies that are active agents for communication, exploration. Architecture within this context of this article was explored as a medium for spatial interfacing. Design is thus considered as durational, real-time, anticipatory, exploring human to machine, machine to machine, and human to human communication. So this was the main illustration that Hollein used in terms of explaining the kind of principle of collage of his article in Baum. This is all as architecture. For the purposes of today's presentation, I would say all as behavior. A lot of the work, I think, that's fundamental in the way that I see architecture and the way that I practice is very much about exploring things and enabling things that use communication in a way to stimulate participation and to sort of enable different forms of engagement. It doesn't matter to me and to my brother and to my colleagues and students if we're talking about robotics, if we're talking about atmosphere, if we're talking about buildings or landscape or ecologies. At the heart of things is to actually see these things as time-based media that evolve over time and to try to facilitate something which I think is very contemporary today, which is an engagement which is active and which allows for forms of learning and evolution to truly become manifest. Projects that we've developed, like the petting zoo, usually focus on images of these kind of robots, somehow by themselves, and somehow people in some way as very passive participants or observers. But for me, it's really about the space in between these things. It's how people engage with things, with space, how they can co-construct and evolve. And I think the terms of reference that we have to sort of explore is also not to get caught up in these kind of fundamental and almost trivial definitions of what words potentially used to mean in the past. So this is an example of Joseph Kosuth, a very important and famous conceptual artist, who made a provocation which he called three chairs in some sense. They all fit the definition of chair, if it's the image of representation of it, if it's the object, or if it's actually the statement in terms of a language-driven kind of definition of what it is. Fundamentally, they all serve the purpose, so I think hiding between if it's object-oriented, if it's this, if it's that, I think somehow misses the basic premise, which is holistically, design is really at stake within all of them. When I think about chair today, I consider some of the experiments of Raffaello di Andrea. If this would play, this would be much cooler. But let's try it again. Thanks, guys. I need some help. It's participatory design at its best. Yeah, this is cool. Okay, imagine a chair. Fantastic. Well, it's good that this presentation is full of videos because from 20 minutes it may be an hour and a half very quickly. Concept of the chair is something that actually identifies its own constitution of parts. So for example, the chair here is not just something that's ascribed as an observer, but it's something fundamental to the thing itself. What happens when everything around us actually have their own agency, their own understanding of themselves? How can we then problematize what is actually really at the heart of a contemporary problem? When we consider, I think, communication in an expanded field, I think we also have to understand that things themselves actually have the capacity to understand the environments that we also occupy. This is basically the vision system of two hoovers, autonomous kind of agents that basically come out when you leave, basically you turn them on, they hoover your space. On the left is the Roomba, on the right is a knockoff Chinese one. Vision systems that are constructed not necessarily in the terms of how we see space, but things themselves constructing their own understanding of how they see space. There's a lot of conversation about smart cities and intelligent environments and all of these other things. When information is at a certain level being talked about in top-down and bottom-up systems, there is a kind of heightened new form, which is this kind of collapse of time and space, which is happening with these kind of machine-learned, supervised learning kind of strategies for autonomous cars being the most, I think, prevalent one, which is basically how can we have immediate real-time kind of proximity of a new search space to enable these machines to coexist within a dynamic environment and at the same time also have generalized principles that can organize these things on larger scale kinds of strategies of swarms. This isn't science fiction, it's fact, and this year was the year that we collectively as a kind of human body, launched some of these kind of pilot programs. This is the UK's version of it. At the same time, it's not just about machines, but in a very weird way, it starts to become heightened by the fact that these things are challenging us to actually ask very different kinds of questions. Challenging, I think, all forms of control, which I believe is a form of illusion to begin with. So if it's Amazon who's talking about drones and delivery, you have Rolls-Royce, which basically talking about changing the whole industry of freight. So agency and behavior, I think, are not fundamentally just things that architects sort of take on board as something of interest, but it's part of actually exploring how technology can fundamentally question, in a very human way, I think, the things that we have around us and how we can actively sort of participate within that. I think it's not very difficult to see that there's a strand of architectural research that has always done that. It's basically under the guise of experimental architecture or avant-garde architecture or whatever kind of word you want to use it. But it's generally trying to look at the problematics of the now. There's the metabolists and the work that they were doing for the Osaka Expo, creating kind of prototypes in a prototypical world to sort of start to tease out what potentially could be new sort of ways that are enabled by the technologies of the time. You can see Sozaki's robot buildings, you have Kurokawa, Kikutaki, all of these characters working in an Asian context. The promise of the city, I think, is really important because I think fundamentally if parametric design has one critical feature is it's in its ability to deal with polyscalar relationships. In principle, identifying things that work on very different scales and how that actually problematizes the way that we think and design and the tools that sort of enable us to sort of participate. This was a promise, I guess, in 1913. This is a cover of Scientific America. The city as a three-dimensional interface with infrastructure, architecture, mobility, all part of a kind of evolving culture. If we look at the strategies today, this is TfL. TfL basically sponsored a series of artists to recreate the vision for what London is going to be in 2026. That vision is very familiar in terms of the context of buildings. It neglects the fact how many towers are really going up in the world. But you will see it privileges a kind of novel entertainment aspect of things. And this is a good representation of what the city is going to be. The bad one we know. Generic. Nobody gives a shit about buildings. We can array things forever. Repeat problems of the very recent past, I think, in the history of architecture. And sort of represented today in a very different world. This one, though, is Frank Lloyd Wright. And if you think that it has to do with a certain attitude of design, it really does. So even in something like Broadacre City, you'll see these flying vehicles, you'll see single occupancy cars. He had an idea of thinking about an integrated strategy between infrastructure, architecture, building, and the mobility agents that are there. If we think about the conversation today, we usually get stuff like this. This is a European Commission, this is Rem Koolhaas, basically saying, my thoughts on the smart city, it's dumb. It's going to make us stupid. The city's going to be intelligent, it's going to treat people like something that's dumb. It seems to me like it's missing the point. But it's not just architects or the architects that in a certain sense are putting forward an argument towards these things. It's also some of our leaders of technology, of science, also having very serious concerns about AI, which maybe it's rightful. We should have concerns about AI and other things. But the concern should be that we're not sort of investigating different sort of opportunities enabled by these things. Once technology is out in the world, it's really important to understand that you can't sort of bury it again. It's out in the world, and I think it's really important that young people today more than ever sort of participate with these technologies, enable themselves to understand them before they criticize them, and in a certain way upgrade the knowledge and the shared kind of contemporary platforms that we have as open frameworks today. For those that are still really suspicious, this is DARPA. This is, what do you call it? American Military Olympics or triathlon. Robots basically trying to do everyday tasks, very expensive robots. Trying to use a drill, trying to get out of a Jeep. If you're worried about the hostile takeover, it's not happening anytime soon. Yeah, you get the point. So in a certain way, we could consider some of the stuff that Cedric Price would say in a space and probably in the same podium. Technology is the answer. What was the question? And the reality of these things is that once architecture tries to participate and to fully invest, you get projects like the Architecture Machine Group of Negroponte, started off with very novel kind of interest to sort of explore new tools. These were CAD systems at the time, and how that would reconsider and reconstruct a certain understanding of not only architecture, but the role of the architect themselves. If you don't know the Architecture Machine Group from its initial term, which was a 2-year project initiated by Negroponte after he graduated from MIT, you may know it as the Media Lab today. If you look at the everyday sort of news, you won't be sort of shocked by titles like this, The Future of Tech, Robots and Designer Babies. This is CNN Money, right? This is Hishiro Ishiguro, who is basically developing a version of himself. There's a little volume on this one.
Professor Hiroshi Ishiguro is Japan's foremost android scientist, and Geminoid HI-1 is Japan's foremost android. Inspired by Japan's unique spiritual beliefs, they are blurring the boundaries between humans and robots.
It's a question of where the soul is. Japanese people have always been told the soul can exist in everything and anything. So we don't have any problem with the idea that a robot too has a soul. We don't make much distinction between humans and robots.
So there's a bit of an agenda on my part, which is to say that this isn't really about robots, but it is fundamentally about how humans sort of engage in things, and also in the construction and the creation of their own sort of design agency. One of the problems is to think of it in the inverse, which is what's actually happening. So, for example, AI software masters of Go take aim at the world's top players, right? A month later, human Go champion, speechless after second loss to Google's DeepMind, AlphaGo computer. A month after that, Lee Sedol apologized to his fans for his powerless display. He might have been better chance if the final two matches, it was extreme pressure, and that somehow further made him, his emotive characteristics made him even more susceptible to the machine. The question of the machine here is slightly trivialized by the way that the media discusses it. They don't talk about the thousands and thousands of engineers that are designing that software to engage this one person. And if the conversation is about technology versus us and all of this kind of stuff, I think it's really the wrong thing to focus on. This is Boston Dynamics, and this is one of the famous videos that they did of their Big Dog project. It went viral, but it went viral for reasons which I think are more than just a robot that looks like some kind of animalistic machine. The fact that they were testing its capacity to react was through kind of gestures like kicking. This actually very much struck a chord with how people were responding to these things. And if you think about the history of robotics, a certain form of history that's not tied to production is really tied to these kind of human relationships. This is Walter Gray Walter, neuroscientist, who was basically exploring the brain, a second-order cybernetician that was looking at things that he designed as tortoises shown at the Festival of Britain. And I think really this image is really at the heart of what he saw, which is actually this kind of cohabitation. For me, enabling is a very important aspect, and that kind of human aspect of conversation is very much a part of a lot of the work that I do with my brother and Minima Forms and my colleagues, and the kind of research that I do with my students in the DRL and my colleagues trying to explore the kind of emotive and behavioral characteristics. It's interesting that we describe these things not as prototypes anymore, but as pets, and we have these kind of gestures which are really about sort of exploring these newfound relationships, not ones that were planned, but ones that were curious and discovered. To go back to ETH very quickly, drones, person, juggling. The machines basically could participate with us, play with us, but they could also play with each other. They don't really need us. What's interesting about this is this kind of playful exchange is very interesting because if you think that this year was the first Drone Olympics, and every year from now on, there's going to be a Drone Olympics and an AI Olympics held in Dubai. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it was something like $15 million prize or something like this. I may stand corrected, but it was in the millions, and the kid that won it was 14 years old. So I think as my time is sort of running out, I sort of want to return to some things which are much more about where we put our attention. It's not the nature of the experiment. I think it's how we sort of explore in a very almost second-order cybernetic approach, like my PhD advisor, who passed away this year, also would say, we're not observers outside of the world, we're observers in the world, and this distinction is very important in terms of how we set up an experiment, how we consider what it is that we see within that. And I think fundamentally and collectively, it's really important that at least the design community recognizes that architecture is a really beautiful thing, but it makes demands. We can talk about it all we want, and our bar is a really good example of people drinking lattes and talking and chatting. But at the hardcore, sort of more fundamental level, I think it's very important for people not to be sort of tourists within this place, but really active participants. And the real battle is not in kind of petty conversations that we may have here, but are the challenges of the new world. So that world outside has a lot of problems that we're inheriting, and architecture, if you look at what's going on, even to the places that are supposedly fundamentally creating spaces for architecture, like MoMA closing its architecture gallery within the MoMA, when you start to see that Architecture Foundation is struggling in all of these different spaces for where architecture is supposed to be nurtured, discussed, debated, provoked, challenging that world outside, I think at the heart of it, one of the reasons that I'm still here is because I believe that this space is one of those places. So thank you for the time. this thing is frozen again.
There's a plug right here.
Thanks. Good afternoon. So I'm Robert Stewart Smith. I also am a studio course master in the DRL, so a colleague of Patrick, Theo and Shajay. And I wrote a paper in the AD called Behavioral Production, which was talking about a lot of the research we've been doing in the AA DRL. So it's been looking into an autonomous swarm constructed architecture. The article started with a discussion on computing and the fact that computing is still perceived mainly as a very manual operation that isn't that far from its origins in typing. I mean, the rooms are pretty much the same. And so there's a conception that computing is a very uncreative exercise, very manual. Yet, in the origins of the modern-day computer, John von Neumann or Alan Turing had completely different ideas about what computing should be. Their conception of computing was one of emergence, self-replication, and artificial intelligence. So you have the process of morphogenesis, or form producing, by Alan Turing on the left, and John von Neumann's universal constructor on the right, which was a concept for how a computer would have a program and the ability to remake itself. And the fact that in remaking itself, it would also inevitably have copying errors and so forth that could lead to mutation and potential evolution. So these concepts are coming from the very founders of the computers you use. You know, these two characters are basically responsible for what you use every day, conceptually and practically. And it's, I would say, something that we shouldn't overlook, that both of them have, right from the beginning, you know, papers written in the late 40s by Alan Turing, already discussing the creative potential of computing, rather than it being purely a sweatshop of manual operation. Now, this creative potential, we're starting to eventually see it. It's funny, I saw Theo had actually the same references, a convergence of things going on in the world right now. So here, Google, both through its artificial intelligence acquisition of DeepMind and through its implementation of such ideas within protocols for autonomous driving, we see both a computational role that is trying to leverage a certain degree of learning, and we see that also manifested within the physical environment. So we're starting to just begin to see perhaps a transition or a trend in computation towards maybe where the founding fathers of computation envisaged it heading. Construction, however, is a completely other matter. So construction has a very segregated process, a completely isolated role of the designer, conceiving of a building, and then through all kinds of contractual complications, we have an execution by other parties with limited input from the architect, and certainly very little creative activity going on at that point. It's purely execution and variation. Robotic construction, which we're starting to see more of now, mainly in terms of fabrication, obviously requires computer programming in terms of how we leverage or implement procedures. You can't do it at the moment by talking or gesturing to the robot. I mean, there will be more and more ways we can interface with these things, but at the end of the day, it is still about an explicit idea, like whether that, let's say it's an explicit idea that is then executed. So there is no dialogue in the moment of manufacture. It's purely in the same kind of category I would put as construction itself, as execution. But we can design by programming, and a lot of us already do, which means that there are many variations of this. You know, there are people that purely write code and out comes a design proposal, and then there's many messy variations or mixtures between, you know, physical and digital modeling and writing a bit of code and going backwards and forwards, drawing. There's many ways we can design a project, but I would say the interesting link here, if we want to get into robotic construction, is to understand that we can also write code creatively. So whether that is part or whole of a project, it's the idea that these two worlds are not separate. And if those two worlds are not separate, then robotic construction becomes potentially creative as well as an act of execution. So to do so on a construction site, it inevitably leads us towards thinking of robots that are embodied or situated, robots that are in the physical environment, something Theo also talked about briefly. And so, for instance, you see examples of that in the iRobot Roomba, where this robot behaves based on what it locally perceives. It doesn't have a global map of a room that it has to vacuum, and it wouldn't be useful to it if it had it, because then you couldn't send this vacuum cleaner into any number of rooms without pre-programming each individual room. So the need for using robots outdoors or in various indoor environments rather than in the factory requires a certain degree of perception and decision-making to be able to be done on the robot itself. A lot of this comes from Rodney Brooks's idea of subsumption architecture. Rodney Brooks was the former head of the AI lab at MIT, and he developed this robot Genghis as the first truly, I would say, truly successful robot at managing to adapt to a situated condition without requiring a massive computer mainframe that simulated the world it was in. Basically, it just used stimulus and response. The idea of subsumption architecture comes from an idea of layered conditional rules. So a hierarchy of just simple rules like if leg A moves, leg B perceives that and will move in a different way. So even walking here is emergent. There is no explicit control that says you have to walk in a particular way. There's a series of conditional rules, and each leg has its own microprocessor. We can also see robotic movement being used for design effect. On the left you have something done with an industrial robot at Gramatzian College Lab. On the right you have a bespoke robot developed by Hod Libson in the States that just happens to be also leaving a similar kind of effect on the ground beneath it. The paper also mentioned swarm robotics, which is an area we're quite interested in. Swarm robotics also developed quite successfully within MIT. Around the same time, like as Rodney Brooks, we had also Maja Matarik, who is still quite active in the robotics community. And this is a very successful attempt at a high population at the time of 14 robots that are able to exchange information and work collaboratively through local rules to move and kind of relocate these pucks, the colored objects you see there. More recently, Radhika Nagpal has managed to use like more than 1,000 robots that she calls kilobots to self-organize and to undertake various collective tasks. So this kind of technology is very much, well, it's developed a lot of capabilities, let's say, in the time between Matarik and Nagpal. We also see projects like this one by Nagpal and Werfel and Pedersen looking into stigmergic processes of construction where robots are able to just locally communicate with one another on what they've already constructed to determine what to construct next. In this case, there's a requirement that the actual brick that they're constructing has communication capabilities. But these principles come from algorithmic rules that are quite known and have been studied by scientists like Eric Bonobo and Guy Thierlaz. where we can talk about how something like a termite mound can be constructed from local rules without an explicit blueprint. So if a termite which has a very, very low processing capability, like you can imagine the size and the amount of neurons in a termite's brain, can construct something that is still arguably considered more performative for environmental purposes than any building known yet today, there's certainly opportunities for us to also embrace some of these logics within construction. Another aspect of that, of course, is that each termite is, without sounding inhumane or, I don't know, unbiological, each termite's redundant in the sense that construction would be achieved even if the termites were exchanged for other termites or so forth. So my experimental architecture group, Kakuja, shared with Roland Snooks, had been developing and still does develop agent-based algorithms for construction. In this case, this was an airport terminal in collaboration with Buro Happold, where structure emerged to solve a certain architectural design through agent-based algorithms. So we already have this kind of familiarity for quite a long time with local rules being used within a design context. 3D printed construction, which is where we've been pushing this work towards now, obviously has capabilities in developing high-resolution designs that have kind of been off the cards mainly for economical reasons, I would argue, for quite a while. And it's also able to compete with existing construction technologies. This is Winsung Decoration Engineering Company in China that's 3D printed a 5-story apartment building and this villa at prices that are a fraction of the cost of traditional construction techniques. So this is already out there in industry. There are other examples of that. This is Enrico Dini's D-shape 6x6 meter 3D printer in Italy. He's showing here on a site, but it's also being used for prefabrication in a factory environment. Koshnevitz in the States has been arguing for quite a while for suburban house construction by 3D printing. And Apis Core in Russia is also arguing that they can now produce a medium-sized house within 24 hours on a 3D printer like this. You can see obvious limitations, though, when you look at this technology. For one thing, although 24 hours is incredibly fast compared to the prevailing technologies that are still out there in industry, the speed here is related to a single nozzle that must occupy an entire construction site as it rotates around. Meanwhile, we have smaller robots already being used on construction sites, like this demolition bot by Husqvarna. So we've been considering what it would be like to use a distributed set of robots on a construction site where you could have exponential speed increases. And you could also make use of non-linear relationships between active robots to make creative decisions on site. So the studio and the AADRL has taken up looking at UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles or quadcopters. These are traditionally controlled manually, operated by remote control. But they can also be operated through computer programming quite precisely in an indoor lab environment through use of motion capture cameras like we have here, Vicon. So this is the setup that we've had for indoor lab testing. But we've also been basically assembling our own versions of these so that they can work outdoors in a more situated condition. And outdoor use of robotics is still quite a difficult field. So we do not have the precision that we have indoors in the lab, but we don't necessarily need it. What we've been doing is embracing that imprecision and embracing the idea of computer vision. Like here you see, this is one of our aerial robots with an extra computer attached on top, and then some video cameras so that we can start to process and make decisions on board. So what this means is that we have to engage in a lot of different technology in order to explore this concept. The concept of it really is, though, and all this kind of different technical adventures are into looking at how we can merge design and construction within a single process, which means we look at things like robot control and robot flight path as something that could be used as part of a 3D printing process. And we develop algorithms to control these robots in parallel so that we really could have a distributed logic for construction. We've been experimenting with material deposition hardware, developing various techniques, and also experimenting with material mixtures, and developing a hardware that can actually be attached to UAVs. Material simulation's been an important aspect in that, understanding and trying to approximate what a material, in this case it's a wax that is dripping as it is deposited, can be used within a design process and then strategized within design. So in this case, this is a wax manual model that is looking at gaining detail through the characteristics and the behavior of the wax as it's drying through actually a very simple helical operation. So there's a convergence between the material behavior, the robot behavior, and the programming. And it's a hard process. So this is kind of as successful as we are right now. So this work is being directed towards this idea of merging construction and design within a singular process. And it's not to argue that that is the ideal way to do everything. It's more an attempt to try to take or claim for design more and more aspects of the way a building is produced. So rather than draw a line in the sand and say, okay, conception must happen before, and then we're going to post-rationalize and then come to a final design, it's more about what constraints or quantitative issues are involved in producing a building, and can any of those be added to the repertoire of design and then expanded on. So in the DRL, we've had a number of design projects speculating on this. We've looked into things like 3D printing of ice and looking at how some aerial vehicles could 3D print something simple here, like a temporary structure, by using locally available material. So in this case, harvesting or collecting snow and writing different ways of search algorithms to collect that. And understanding that a distributed set of robots could use a 3D model, but we can also calculate deviations within what they actually achieve compared to what they intended to achieve. And then we can actually design deviation in. So in this case, the explicit model that was provided for the simulation was just a simple dome. And then the rules that are executed in real time determine the actual material organization of the design. So we're now saying half the design happens before construction, half happens during construction. So these are different algorithms for producing wall sections out of ice. And then these are being tested for their thermal performance. So we're creating here different cavity conditions, and we're able to quantify how much material is there and also the thermal performance. That's the result of these students' work. And it has a high resolution of detail that is actually intrinsic to the way it was produced. So we can actually describe there how many robots were used, how much material, and what were the actual rules that produced that, even though it was determined in real time. And through that process, it has an articulation or expression that is derived from the way it was made. This is another project by students who recently finished, who were also speculating how we could make use of UAVs for 3D printing in remote environments. In this case, speculating on desert construction near oases for desert greening, where the material that was printed and the support material of the print are basically the sand that's locally sourced. So it operates a little bit like a STL process, like a printing a binder onto a sand dune effectively and then removing the sand dune afterwards. So one can experiment with different ways that you can organize material and what kind of structural implications they have. But we can also strategize local design behaviors. So in this case, it's an aero robot using computer vision to find what is already printed in order to print next. So we don't necessarily need precision, we just need local adaptation to what we have already done. So this actually works in a similar way to termites. This is a design proposal they had, where what you see is a complex interplay of what is a weak material. There is a high level of geometric complexity and layering that tries to compensate for that, almost like an egg shell or something, to arrive at a more coherent structure. And that is about as accurate as far as that operation is going now, but there'll be more on that coming. So you can see there a kind of tethered power supply and a 3D print nozzle printing onto a small-scale sand dune. Another project that has leveraged this kind of issue of remote construction looked at 3D printed bridges in remote areas. And the interesting thing about this is if you try to 3D print a bridge from two opposing sides, those two opposing sides are cantilevered until you form the bridge in the middle. So you have a change in structural condition. And it's obviously difficult to do something like this, just start to print out flat. So design models were done, structural analysis developed to determine material placement strategies. And I'll skip through that a bit. This is a real-time anticipatory structural analysis. So the idea here being that there's an intended design model. There might be deviation because of wind or something on site. So a few steps ahead of what is already printed is being analyzed. And if there is a problem flagged, construction pauses and a new support is added before construction continues. So that support would not have been there in the original design. Hardware was developed by the students for 3D printing horizontally with resin, and models produced. And the goal of these models is to try to develop techniques for cantilevering that use a minimal amount of material but maximize design expression with that in mind. And then, looking at how that hardware gets attached. So just give me a sec. So this is the initial design proposal the students had. That basically it's a remote village, and the project's a pedestrian bridge that doubles as a lookout, and that it provides a shortcut. So the model is basically explicitly modeled to begin with, structurally analyzed for certain principles, until something is relatively viable. And then the actual design occurs during the construction process. So that model you saw was the input, but there's a whole lot, and that model is only viable when it's constructed. So the goal of the simulation is to not only construct it, but make sure that this structure is viable for the entire process. So all the green and yellow you see there is locally determined during the construction process as kind of ridging. And that actual construction sequence is integral to the design. So you cannot separate the construction method or sequence from the final design proposal in a sense. And there's a sequence of it. Just quickly, I should speed up. There were a number of projects also looking at thread-based weaving, where we started looking into even mixing humans into the loop just in terms of prototyping, but looking for algorithms that are robust enough to engage with different site conditions, where the only variation is in the input parameters, essentially. So you write an algorithm, but you can execute different designs with that based on your site conditions. And this was done a few years ago, looking into a temporary installation being autonomously fabricated by these aero robots. Now, this was developed by simulation, but then executed as like a pre-recorded simulation. So this is not situated robotics in this sense, right? Although their positioning is situated. But since then, we've managed to develop a lot more autonomous capabilities. So in this case, you have a UAV autonomously avoiding threads. So you could imagine this being redone in the previous simulation. So its goal here is just to get to the other side of the room. And then it's using computer vision. Or in this case, two UAVs have a simple rule that makes them spin in a circle formation in relation to one another. And these were used in the last project I'll show you in a proposal by students that was just completed a few months ago for a temporary event space that used balloons as aerial scaffolds. So computer vision, that video is not going to work. Computer vision here was used to identify balloons and then to undertake a series of procedures to manipulate those balloons and to wrap something else around the balloons. So the simulations themselves took into account the constraints of the computer vision, like the cone of vision and the depth control, and a number of different ways of actually moving through space and calculating position were developed that can go from global views like motion capture through to computer vision and mixtures in between. And then these aerial scaffolds strategies were developed. So balloons are on strings anchored to the ground, and the UAVs are able to pick up balloons and wrap one thread around another thread and reposition them in space. And simulating this, you can speculate what you can do with more balloons, higher threads, and so forth. And you can do things like create stable tower-like structures. Helium balloons can last for about a week in this kind of condition, like slightly larger balloons. So you can create stable-like structures by triangulating. And if you extend the length of thread, then you can also create larger structures just by constantly amassing information. So this is the students actually testing their principles physically. So this is an autonomous wrapping based on the local programming of the UAVs. This is a quick manual test of their kind of design strategy. So they wrap individual towers, and then they eventually cut some of the anchors so that some of those nodes then lift up into the air to make a canopy. And then it came to developing a material. So this is a material the students develop that is, they can make a fiberglass-like material or a kind of plastic-like material, but it basically works off the principle of fairy floss. And this is a UAV autonomously creating a kind of almost like a spider's silk by autonomously pulling away from a fairy floss machine. So what you have here is a robot kind of creating the material as part of its role. And then this is an autonomous navigation for how a robot could find that fairy floss machine to collect that material in the first place. So based on reading these different markings, these QR tags, the robot's able to kind of dock and then move into location. So the final proposal from those students was a temporary event space at the Burning Man Festival. It basically utilized all local computer vision strategies for its design proposal, and it was proposed as something that was designed over time. So basically, the Burning Man Festival lasts for a number of days, so the whole idea was that the design would constantly shift and accommodate the number of different events going on at the site. So you might start with constructing one event, and then you might make changes to that, and then amass further events. So you can actually go have an idea of a temporal architecture that is not inert, but much more engaged in the kind of space and time constraints of events like the Burning Man. That's kind of the proposal there. So this work is continuing now, also in a science and engineering grant by the government, where a lot of this work will be taken to a much higher level. And so I guess our onus on design speculation becomes even more apparent because a lot of the things we struggle with, of course, and our limitations are things that just are not in our domain. But our domain is still in there. And yeah, as I said before, the goal is to converge design and construction where practical for creative purposes. Thank you.
Why don't you invite some questions?
Sure. Any questions?
Come on, guys.
Yes? Can't hear you, sorry. Speak, just yell. Good question. What's the role of intuition? Okay. So, I mean, I like to think I'm a designer. I like to think my students are designers. And that our primary goal is to speculate on different forms that architecture could take. And when I mean form, I mean different actualizations of architecture in all its capacity. And obviously everything you do is focused on one or two things. Intuition, I don't think that any designer would argue that they have no intuition. And intuition is definitely learnt over time. And even writing computer programming, you develop an intuition to program. And the other thing I would say is a lot of what you see is actually non-linear, meaning it's unpredictable. Most of it is deterministic in the sense that if you were to rerun a simulation, you would get the same result. But in the real world, when you do it, you will not get the same result because the conditions in the world are different each time. Sometimes another aspect of non-linear work is that sensitive dependence, it's called, where a small shift in the initial conditions can make a huge difference in the result. So this unpredictability, you actually develop an intuition as well for the type of result you get. So what I mean by that is first you have your designer intuition and you still make normal design decisions. You might conceptualize the overall diagram of a project in the same way any architect does. At the same time, when you sit down to write code, you also have intuition. And then there's a third level of intuition, which is that you start to gain an intuition for how behavior-based algorithms operate, or how behavior-based robots operate. And so you start to know that certain things don't work so well, or certain things do. I think it's interesting too, though, because I think intuition changes as you learn things. So what I'm very interested in now is how can our levels of perception also be extended by things like computer vision. So what I mean by that is computer vision is agnostic to architecture, it's agnostic to design, but you as an individual might be able to read into some of these things like thermal imaging, for instance, microstructural analysis. There's all kinds of things that probably will gain an intuition for as well. Except there's a question there after too.
Thanks. The question is, if you extrapolate your vision of the future, we see the extinction of the construction worker. or do you see a way to coexist and there's still an electrician, or how far do you think this will go?
Fair question. So in terms of the greater research we're doing in collaboration with all those institutions, there is someone in haptics and human-robot interaction involved, and there is an emphasis on the human as very much part of being involved in that process, particularly in roles of observation. Pattern recognition is one area where human still far surpass what is achievable in other ways. But I think the concern there would be something that let's say there's more than one answer to that question. For instance, within construction we have sometimes questionable ethics of treatment of workers. We also have issues of safety. Like more than 50% of worker-related deaths in the UK each year is from construction sites. And in fact, more people have died on construction sites during the Afghanistan war than in Afghanistan, from the UK, I mean, right? So it's actually a huge number of, there's a huge number of safety concerns there. But at the same time, I understand where the concern comes, obviously, from a question like that. But what we're doing here is speculating more on the design potential of engaging in other elements of work. And actually, I would say that it actually opens up a lot of questions and opportunities. Like, I don't think the work subscribes necessarily to one style of design, for instance. It's very much engaged in the materials and the processes that would determine what's possible. And human participation is very much possible in that too. You even saw some of the students actually developing things alongside that. And I think going back to Thea's point of DeepMind, that it was kind of developed by thousands of engineers. Once again, I think there's a lot of human work here and human intuition. It's just a question of where it's been placed. Yeah.
Thanks. In your presentation, I can see that you start with a very generic material, like you're trying to kind of like mimic the concrete with wax and stuff like that. But do you think your process somehow informs back to the design in a different way? So we actually have to design something completely with a different conception from the beginning? So because we're starting with a load-bearing kind of like a logic, but is there something that we're learning from your experiment that you're actually trying to push forward, like new method, weaving system, or some different types of construction methodology?
Well, 3D printed construction, even with regular kind of 3D construction scale 3D printers, is already emphasizing reduction of material. Like, because we can build more complex things, we're able to create much more filigree cavity structures and things. So we are, I think, going to see 3D printing be part of the future trajectory of construction. I'm not saying everything, but it'll certainly be a part of it. And with that will come a reduction in material. When you start using aerial robots, then weight becomes a huge issue. So a number of the students have developed different materials that try to capitalize on reducing that weight. Like this last material you saw was incredibly inventive, I would say, what they developed. I mean, they managed to get calculated, I think it was something like 100 meters of material out of something that was 100 grams. Like, and it has some tensile capacity. They've tested it, load tested and thing. So, yeah, I mean, I think sometimes, like, for instance, the moon landings demanded a certain level of performance that we might not need back here, but there's spin-off things. And I think every time you speculate with something very difficult, like something like aerial construction, it's not to argue that everything should be done that way, but you can learn some lessons about things like material efficiency that hopefully can feed back into other technologies and practices.
Just want to pick up two of the points from the audience. One was the question about the role of intuition, and you came back and emphasized its importance. And then you mentioned yourself the importance of the design potentiality you're looking after. And here also I think there was an implied question about design repertoires which emerge and how this learning through what happens and is possible through swarm, let's say, tectonics, how that feeds back to a designer's intentionality. And I think, I just want to make that point, that there's a kind of a vacuum at that core question. Now, to step back, the presentation is incredibly sophisticated, and everybody who's witnessing here should obviously be superbly attracted to this, to you and us who's delivering to the field this level of intelligence, sophistication, with also with an understanding of what it takes and what the potentials are in the abstract. So that's fantastic and wonderful. Where I'm pushing in, and what I think needs to be put on the table, and that's where I'm challenging you guys, is with respect to that design intentionality. So one of the things I've been saying is, let's say, all the swarm intelligence and process logics or bottom-up constitution of a construction, these precisely that intelligence, and the same goes with Theo's kind of self-assembly swarms and their bottom-up constitution of behaviors, which then lead to kind of constructions, is wonderful. But that I'm urging, and that these intelligences and methodologies are produced to simulate the life process and understand its requirements and desires and measures of success, which are what clients would be really interested in the first place. So, and again, in a sense, what you're working on is, of course, you make a construction. There's a number of engineering feedbacks with respect to finite element analysis, the structural feasibility, the ability to absorb contingencies, I mean, locally adaptive with respect to climatic issues, and then you, in the end, so we're managing to deliver, for instance, that complex branching bridge, or we managing to deliver these kind of clusters of shell, where you pointed out how the fibers kind of density distribution is adaptive to structural forces and local conditions. All this is wonderful, but there's no comment and no message and no reflection about the overall intentionality and purposefulness of these particular morphologies. So that's all taken for granted. So that's the vacuum we need to fill. And just pointing that out, and that's where you withdraw intuition or single phrases like design potentiality, and that's I will speak. I will come back after the break, which we're now having, after to try to tease a little bit more out what this might mean, what you call design potentiality, and what the criteria of success of design are. Not just that you manage to construct something and that it meets certain structural criteria, but you manage to design something profoundly life-enhancing with respect to the kind of civilization we want to become and are in the process of becoming.
Okay. Do you want me to answer that or just leave it there?
Try.
I won't touch on answering that, but I will add one thing from my side because I might not be here when you have that discussion. So one thing in particular that I think is seen across all those projects, regardless of material or overall design constraints. One thing for sure is that there is quite a detailed level of material articulation. And that material articulation is intrinsic to the construction or production process. And it is designed, but it's not explicitly described. And I think where I'm particularly interested in that is that I think that, well, one thing, it addresses quantitative issues, but I think it's also reinvigorating an articulation within design that has been quite missing for quite some time. We see it in the Baroque and the Art Nouveau and things like this. We see it in classical architecture too, but we haven't seen much of it, I would say, since modernist periods, mainly because...
But what do we need it for?
Okay, so, well, I would say it's shifting a little bit. I wouldn't say it necessarily is needed for forms of representation, but I would say that it has always been a part of architecture.
What else could it be?
Yeah, so, well, it has always been a part of architecture, and I think...
Why?
Yes, well, we'll get there. But so it's always
Well,
been there, and we
I don't
see. I think we see some of the last of it in people like Louis Sullivan or Frank Lloyd Wright, and I think then there was kind of a chasm, mainly produced through the economy, not necessarily the ideology. There is a little bit in the ideology of the architect.
It was
in
always
response.
there, but yes, but Rob, it is maybe unfair, but you won't be able to answer this question. But I'm urging you that the answer is in my writings, and we all got to put our noses in there and then have a frank discussion. But on that note, let's break.
All right. Sorry.
I need to push a bit harder.